I'm so excited to share with you guys today something that has never before been made publicly available. It's the first homily that Father McCarthy ever gave back in 1981. It was sent to me by a friend of his named Greg, who was actually there that day, sitting in the audience. And Greg said the following: I have maintained that this story of Charlie's experience is worthy of inclusion in those extraordinary stories that have occurred in the history of Christianity. While the homily was told just shy of 40 years ago, it is as clear as if it happened yesterday. I was 24 and my wife Peg was 23 at the time. When this will be made more public is up to Charlie. Well, now's the time. Father McCarthy has given me permission to publish this homily on my podcast. The homily was given after he returned from his ordination by Patriarch Maximus V on August 9th, 1981 in Damascus, Syria. So yes, today, August 9th, represents the 40th anniversary of Father McCarthy's ordination. So for those of you who have been listening to him on the podcast, if you're on YouTube, you can leave him a comment and wish him happy anniversary. This is a great story. I had never heard it before. I didn't even know this recording existed. But it's about the mystery in which human beings exist, and it's about destiny and the fact that each one of us has a destiny. So if you've ever wondered what God's plan is for your life, or if you sometimes start to wonder if there's any plan at all when it comes to anything, take a listen to this podcast. I think you'll find it to be tremendously inspiring and worthy of pondering in relationship to your own life and existence itself. I do apologize for the quality of the video. It's an old recording and I did my best, but if you need to, there's a transcript in the show notes and you can follow along with that if you'd like. Also, if you're listening to this on the regular podcast, you might want to check out the video on YouTube because there will be some beautiful photos to accompany the presentation. Thank you so much to Greg for sending me this homily and the transcript as well, and to Father McCarthy for letting me share it with others. Now keep in mind, because this was a homily, there were time constraints, so many details had to be left out. And another important thing to remember is that this was not delivered to a regular congregation. It was delivered to an audience that was comprised mostly of people who had known Father McCarthy since birth or since he was a little kid. And for decades, they had known nothing of what had been going on in his life. So his tone and his presentation had to take that into account, and the negativity of certain difficulties had to be watered down so as not to offend anyone. A little bit of background. Father McCarthy was born on October 9th, 1940. The events that he recalls here happened mostly between 1958 and 1981. Now, I don't know much about what happened in Charlie's life before 1958, but I have heard one story that I would like to share with you because I think it's really relevant. He once said that a lot of people would come up to him and they would ask him, why do you think it is that you were able to see things in the Gospels or hear things that other people couldn't see and other people couldn't hear? Or why were you able to do the things in your life that you did? Many of the things that Father McCarthy did in his life required so much careful discernment, so much patience and fortitude and trust in God. And he made a lot of hard choices on his life's path, like the time he left practicing law to go teach, or the time he left teaching at the University of Notre Dame because Dow Chemical and the CIA were there recruiting Christian students during the Vietnam War. He told me that his best guess was that from the time of his first communion in second grade, he decided that if receiving the Eucharist was really what Jesus said it was, then he saw no reason why anyone wouldn't choose to receive it every single day. So from that point forward, the young Charles McCarthy got up and went to 6:15 or 7:30 Mass every day. He hiked 9/10 of a mile to church, attended Mass, and hiked 9/10 of a mile home. His mom would feed him breakfast and send him off to school. Now, there was a church that was closer, he told me. It was called St. Peter's, but that was the Italian church, so they didn't go to that one. So I think what Father McCarthy said is that he attributes a lot of what has happened in his life to the graces that he received from attending daily Mass. And I think that's important background to the story you're about to hear, which starts when he's about 18 years old. So one final thing before we get to the homily. Father McCarthy wanted me to read this note to you. He said, "Ellen, may I request that if you are going to use my homily at my first divine liturgy," that's the Mass, "after being ordained, which you received from Greg, that you present it in a fashion that does not aggrandize me in any way. In 1981, I gave this homily for the greater glory of God, who is love, for the salvation of souls, and to communicate and illustrate that God has his own way of action in human history. Before and after my ordination, I was and am just another sinner, who is a son of God, and that God has to work with in his love for me, which is exactly his relationship with all of his other sons and daughters yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The homily was not intended to have me as its focus. I was and am just a single lump of clay that God, by his love, molds into his instrument for purposes which we will never know until we arrive in heaven. No one is more loved by the Father of all than anyone else, and no one's life is more important or needed than any other person's life in God's plan for the salvation of all from evil and death." End quote. The following homily was delivered at St. Gregory the Theologian Melkite Catholic Seminary on September 13th, 1981.
God is love. That's what it says on the back of my vestments in Greek. Most of you know me as a person of rather severe logic. My retreats, my workshops, talks, etc., can probably be diagrammed in terms of symbolic logic. Usually, if I prepare properly, there is no logical stone left unturned. But the truth of the matter is that there is more than logic to reality. We live in a world in Western civilization, in the latter half of the 20th century, where certainty, the phenomena of certitude, is derived primarily from logical thinking. And therefore, people go about the business of conducting their lives logically, which is fine. Well, to move from here to the door, the logical principle is that you walk in that direction and not in that. However, logic is a dimension of existence. It's not all of existence. Logically, as you all know, logically it is possible to prove that God exists. And logically it's possible to prove that God does not exist. Likewise, logically it is possible to prove that you are. And likewise, logically it is possible to prove that you are not. Philosophy of skepticism. Logically, it's possible to prove that infinity exists. And logically, it is possible to prove that infinity does not exist. Logic is a dimension of reality, a part of reality. It is not all of reality. It is a way to a kind of certitude. It is not the only way to certitude. Logical thinking, logic is a limited tool of the human mind that in our society has been raised to the level of a god. It has become the only way of experiencing reality. It has reached the point in formal scholarship, in everyday life, in various dimensions of the church, that what is not logical is not real. And that is a patent absurdity. Utter and complete. Consider the certainty involved, the absolute certainty involved in the experience of beauty. You cannot logically reach beauty. You cannot logically prove beauty. But when you experience beauty, you know it with a certitude that surpasses all syllogisms. Or the certitude involved in the experience of an innocent child. In that experience of innocence, one cannot prove innocence logically, but one knows when one is in the presence of it. It is different, it is real, it is there. Or on the negative side, the experience of fear. Logically, one cannot prove oneself into or out of fear, and the experience itself is not logical. But it's real, even though it is not logical. Or perhaps we could look at the experience of love. Love baffles all logic, beyond all logic. It is not an experience that is logically provable or logically verifiable, but it is an experience that when it is there, it is a reality that when we're in the presence of it, we are certain it is there and it is real. Likewise, God. We live in a world where indeed logic in and of itself will bring us to God or bring us away from God. God can be proved logically or disproved logically. But God, the real God, the living God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who is Jesus, is not the God of the logical philosophers. God is a living reality. The problem is, for the human being who says that what is not logical is not real, and then proves that God can be disproved logically, that person comes out with no God. Except perhaps something that he or she feels that they must give some sort of fearful obedience to, just in case the logic goes the other way. The center of life, center of reality, is not logical. If you think about it carefully, the most logical system of thinking in the world is the scientific method. And that has to be proved experientially in the end. It has to be proved by experiments that can be ultimately seen, touched, tasted, and felt, depending upon what's being used. And so, what I'd like to do, on the basis that God is love, I would like to tell you a love story. I would like to tell you a God story. It is not logical, but is true and is real. It's a love story and it's a God story. And the truth of it is known for certain. The reality is that love and God go dwarf all human logic. They are real. They are one. They are beyond the certainty of the most sophisticated computer. Between the most finite program of logic that can be put into a computer, and the certainty of beauty, and the certainty of love, and the certainty of God, there lies an abyss. The love story, or the God story, which I would like to tell you, begins in the summer of 1958. 1958. As I was about to go to the University of Notre Dame for the freshman year, my freshman year. In that summer, with a clarity that is beyond logic and beyond causality, with a certitude that is very, I can bring back to consciousness today, it was communicated to me that my destiny and my vocation in life, unambiguously and unequivocally, was to be a married priest in the Eastern Rite Church. Did not ask for the experience, did not plan the experience. It came, it was, it can be remembered, and it was clear and unambiguous. I did not know what the Eastern Rite Church was. I had never been to a Byzantine service. I knew vaguely that there were such things, and I proceeded in the summer of 1958 to go to St. Clement's Shrine, where a Russian priest by the name of Father Moet celebrated Divine Liturgy weekly. And it was in Russian, and it was difficult, odd, strange, and nothing particularly appealing to it, except that there was total meaning in going there because of the prior communication, which was totally clear. And throughout that summer, I tried to find books on the Eastern Rite Church or Eastern theology or something like that. Everything was, of course, not in English. And so I went to the University of Notre Dame, and as a step in this direction, I chose to take Russian my freshman year. Because the one church that I knew at that time was a Russian church, and it seemed like a logical thing to do to fulfill what was destiny. And so I took Russian, signed up for the course right at the end, and so forth and so on, and proceeded to run into a course where they had run out of Russian books. And for 5 weeks, I was trying to use a Russian book that this person had and this person had, and simply falling further and further behind until the books came to the bookstore. And I managed to flunk Russian. And this, of course, was a serious problem, a serious blow, but it did nothing to undercut the fundamental experience of what I was supposed to be. In the fall of 1958, when I went to Notre Dame, the man who was the spiritual director for the freshmen at that time was a Boston priest by the name of Father Dan O'Neill. And so he came around and gave some talks in the halls and so forth, and people went to see him. So I went to him, and I explained to him precisely this experience that I had of what was clear as to what my destiny was, at least partly. And he didn't mean it, but he said it was impossible. He said such a thing in the world in which we live is only theoretically possible. It is practically impossible. simply in the United States cannot move from the Latin rite to the Eastern rite and become a priest. No one would ever accept that. People try it every once in a while. It is literally impossible. He said he did not feel in conscience that he could help it because it was going down a road that simply could not be fulfilled. But he said what he would do would be that he would pray for me. And never again did I talk to Dan O'Neill about the matter. I knew him at Notre Dame when I taught there, and simply never talked to him. Something that had occurred, I assumed when I was at Notre Dame he had forgotten about it. So I went through the first couple of years at Notre Dame, coming back in the summers and getting in contact with other Christian Eastern churches in the Boston area, going to the services and the liturgies and so forth, finding very little in English. And what was there in English was really heavy-handed history and theology that was difficult to understand and follow and read. And then in my junior year, I decided that something had to be done about this. So I went to see a priest, and this is not Ted Hesbury, because some of you know my relationship with Ted Hesbury, and that this is not him. I went to see a priest who I assumed would have a knowledge about how to do this. And I talked to him and explained it in detail. The nature of the experience, the certitude of it, the fact that the certitude hadn't left, the fact that daily, as I went to Mass and Communion, I prayed about it, prayed equally that if it is to be, let it be. If it isn't to be, get rid of it. I just know that's fine. Anyway, it's fine. And this priest, very famous and important man, after an hour's explanation, he laughed at it. Physically laughed. And he called in a priest who had the office next to him. Now, I was a junior at Notre Dame, and asked me to re-explain the story. So I did. And they both laughed together about married priests. Parenthetically, I might mention, the day of my ordination, the patriarch told me that at the time these two priests were laughing, there was on the Notre Dame campus a married priest who was forbidden to celebrate liturgy at that time, but he was there and they knew it. They couldn't have fun with it. At any rate, they laughed, and what this did to someone who was 20 years old and who was facing very important men who knew all about theology in the church and so forth, it was a crushing phenomenon. And so, from that point on, I never talked directly to anyone about it. Absolutely no one. Daily, I mean daily, prayed about it. Daily, it was never out of my mind. But never talked to anyone directly. Wrote letters to people asking them about the possibility and so forth, both Western and Eastern priests, bishops, and so forth. Not talking about it in personal terms, just general discussion, and everyone saying the same thing. This is impossible. It's theoretically possible. It's practically impossible. Forget it. Make your choice between what's available to you, what is in front of you, as far as real possibilities. Don't be thinking in terms of abnormal possibilities. Choose the reality that's given to you. Don't try to create a reality. Which would have been fine, except the initial experience was unequivocal as to what I should do. And so, 1961 and 2 passed. 1963 and 4 and 5, and I can remember if I just put myself in the Sacred Heart Church at Notre Dame, or at St. Ignatius Church in Chestnut Hill over here, or the church in Millis, or in the church out in Auburndale out here, I can remember sitting there day in and day out, week in and week out, year in and year out, praying that this burden either be lifted or it be fulfilled. 63 and 64 and 65 past, things going on, things happening, and so forth. War law school and what have you. 67, made the decision to quit working in law and to go out to Notre Dame to study theology, which was just simply unheard of. No one knew why, no one understood. 69, 70, 70, some fellas from Notre Dame came out here to work in a rather unique political campaign, and I can remember taking them over to Our Lady of Kazan Church in South Boston, which was a Byzantine Catholic church, to the liturgy on a few occasions, and I often wondered what they thought of going to such a place, going such a distance, an abnormal way to go to a strange liturgy, which was still in Russian at that time. And but we did. We went over there, and 73 and 74 and 75 and 76, day in, day out, year in, year out, hour in and hour out in some cases. Because it was controlling of the whole life. Communication was clear as to what my destiny was, and there was no destiny outside of that. And until the communication had been changed, there was no choice but to pursue it by whatever means were possible, which were none. None. No one knew. Then, one June night, in June 1978, I had a dream. I will tell you, you know me as a person of logic. You know nothing about this side of me or anything else. But I had a dream. And the dream was, and there are people who can verify this because I told them immediately after. The dream was that Father Dan O'Neill from Notre Dame, who I hadn't thought of in 20 years, since 1958, this is 1978, was in the dream trying to communicate something to me in the Sacred Heart Church at Notre Dame. The dream was awesome in its power, not positive or negative, just the impression it made on the mind. I woke up in total recall of it, the experiential dimensions, the pictorial dimensions, and so forth, which I can to this moment. And it was just a powerful experience, not positive or negative, but powerful. And so I walked downstairs that morning, went to church, Mass, and Millis, picked up the pilot in the back of the church, walked home, opened up the pilot in the study. The first thing I saw was Father Dan O'Neill died, which added to the whole experience. Added to the whole experience, awesome in its strangeness and curiosity. Nothing is on my mind since the dream but the fact that Dan O'Neill, I pick up the newspaper, and Dan O'Neill is dead. And I'm looking at the newspaper, and this is totally involved with my consciousness and so forth, and the strangeness and so forth of it. And I'm looking at the newspaper, and I look at the newspaper, and I see a picture of a priest, Father Paul Frechette. And I look underneath, and it says, this is the pilot part, it says Father Paul Frechette was just ordained recently, and that he attended seminary at St. Gregory's Seminary in Newton Center. I'll drop your logic for a minute and everything. But what happened at that moment was, instantly, there was an explicit, a direct, an unequivocal communication equal to the power of the first that read, and these are the words, they were not words, it was a total experience that read, your time of waiting is over. Your time has arrived. These are imperative sentences. Go to St. Gregory's, for it is there that you will fulfill your destiny to become a married Catholic priest of the Eastern Rite. Clear. Clearer than the podium in front of you. no ambiguity, total certitude. Awesome. Awesome. Not a fraction of an inch of doubt. I put the word here, which is true. He was fearful, which I had to work at. God is love. There's no reason to fear. But the abnormality of it made it fearful. But it was clear. And I couldn't believe it. But it was clear. And it was as clear as the original communication. And indeed, there was no choice but to go to St. Gregory's. So that morning I drove up. And I stopped over here in Newton at a donut shop because even though the communication was clear, the remembrance of the discussion at Notre Dame with the two priests 20 years earlier was powerful. It had never left. And my feeling was to come here was to again be rejected, scorned, or simply told that this is theoretically possible but technically impossible. Practically impossible. Forget about it. So I sat over at the donut shop and finally looked up the number in the telephone book and drove around and finally found the place. Came here, parked over on Everett Street, the street next, and walked up the stairway 3 times and walked back. Because I knew what was going to happen. Despite the experience and the certitude and the clarity, the rejection from 20 years earlier, and everything that has gone on between then and now, or then and then, was a total negation that it could not be. Universally, everyone saying it can't be, basically don't bother me. You know, I'm in serious business. And so finally, when I was walking away the 3rd time, I said to myself, you know, if you don't do this, you will be forever wondering if you should. And so I walked up the stairs and rang the bell. And no one answered, which was a relief. And I started to walk away. I said, well, you know, if you don't ring the bell again, you'll always be wondering someone didn't hear it. Chances are there's no one there anyway. So I rang the bell a 2nd time. And a fellow who was a deacon and a priest now, Mark Maloney, answered the door. And I said that I'd like to talk to the rector of the seminary, who was Father Charles Moody. So Charlie and I sat down in that room there, and we talked for an hour and a half. And everything that I told you up to this moment in time, I told him then. Everything. Well, my assumption was there was no need of kidding anyone. This was either going to be done in truth or it wasn't going to be done at all. It was out of my power. And also proceeded to be very, very clear of what my relationship was in terms of Christianity, Dorothy Day, and so forth and so on. No ifs, ands, or buts. In fact, almost to the point of laying things out so clearly that you couldn't possibly accept me. And of course, the abnormality of the situation. Degrees in philosophy and education, law, and theology, and so forth. Very abnormal situation. And for the first and only time in the entire history of this phenomenon, Charlie said, I will help you. I will help you. No priest, no bishop, Eastern or Western, had said anything in 20 years, with the exception of Dan O'Neill, who said I'd break you, had said anything in 20 years other than impossible, forget about it, get your head together, look at reality the way it is. And so, Charlie said that day that he would help. And for the last 3 years, Charlie has been the single and the greatest, and in many instances, the only source of help. People have come along after and begun to help and tried to help and left. Charlie has stayed. It has been an awesome 3 years in the sense of an agony. Everything was and was controlled by this sense of destiny. All other things were done, but this was what had to be met. The day that I left here, that morning, back in June of 1978, I walked out on the porch, and I felt a tremendous sense of relief because of the communications, and this was it, and so forth and so on. Tremendous sense of relief. And that was the last moment of peace that I would know with this until the day of my ordination. There was no other relief. In fact, from that moment on, life became an agony. Indeed, it was theoretically possible and technically impossible, or practically impossible. The pieces that had to fall together for it to happen are beyond the ability of anyone to bring together. And when you look at it, you even think they're beyond God's ability to bring together. Between Rome and Damascus and here and political problems and all kinds of other things. Years and years and years that dragged on. 3 years, as a matter of fact. The reason I'm communicating this is that it seems to me important to think through a little bit something about the nature of the statement God is love. Work out. Even when I was over there in Damascus in August, there opened up a possibility of change. And so the stance had to be that you were doing what you were supposed to do and let the ripples happen as they should. For 23 years. And building an entire life around that in terms of children being born, needs, and so forth. I assure you, if I had known what it would cost to come from 1958, from August 9th, 1981, I could not have done it. The pain and the suffering are too much. Were too much. The isolation and so too much. Couldn't be done. Fortunately, I didn't. I was supposed to be ordained in the last week of January in 1981. It was decided on December 19th, with a final telephone call between the Archbishop and the Patriarch, that I was supposed to be ordained in the last week of January. On December 23rd, my father had to have an operation, and that operation was to occur in the last week of January. And so there became a rather horrendous situation that arose. The choice between staying home with my mother and father for the operation, or going to fulfill what had been a 23-year odyssey in terms of destiny. We worked at it and prayed on it. On January 13th, what took place was that made the decision to stay. Talked to the bishop, and the bishop said, well, that was fine, and he'd rearrange it whenever we wanted. So, indeed, we stayed for the operation. It was the right thing to do, and so forth and so on. A few weeks after the operation, the Patriarch, who was central to all of this, and without whom it could not have been done, was shot with attempted assassination. The bullet went across his cheek. If he had been shot, it would have been the end of everything. Everything was conducted through him. Then he was in the hospital. And then when he finally got out of the hospital, and we tried to rearrange it, they had to postpone it indefinitely because of some past newspaper article. So it was postponed indefinitely as of April. So, when the patriarch came here in June, we finally worked it out. The original date set was August 15th, and then August 2nd, then August 3rd, for the ordinations at the diaconate, then the 4th, so it was left at the 4th. And then I got over there, and the dates were totally switched around. First, deacon was changed to the 6th, the ordination was changed to the 10th, and then it wasn't going to be, and then it got back to the 9th and 8th. And finally, the days that we arrived on were the 6th and the 9th of August. Which, to those who know me, those are very important dates. It was utterly out of my control that those dates should be arrived on. What they were for me was confirmation that the decision in January was correct. And so it is possible to say, but things have worked out well for you in this, and therefore you are saying that God is a God of love. It's not so. It's not so. There is not a soul in this room or any place that I know of, if they could see what had to be gone through to get to here, would accept it. Nor would I. Nor would I. But it is true. The totality of the experience is, that there is a benign, guiding hand even in the cross, even in suffering. And so God is love. We decided to put on the back of the vestment. That's what Jesus means when he says God is Father. And one may wonder, what is it that, knowing my dedication to Dorothy Day and St. Francis and those people there, how can you be dressed in vestments like this, and so forth and so on? It's the reality. We live by symbols. When St. Francis walked out to the city square in front of the Bishop of Assisi and his father, and took off all his clothes and threw them there, and stood there naked, the statement was, God is love. That he needed nothing of worldly material in order to survive. That God would take care of him. The vestments that I have on say God is love on the back. And indeed, they're symbolic. They're the vestments that I was ordained in. And when I put on other vestments in other places and other times, they are an extension of this symbol. But they are also the vestments that I'll be buried in. There is no more revolutionary or profound statement that can be made. It is not possible to conceive in human language a symbol. A statement more important, a statement that is made. Someone chooses to be buried with the statement God is love. That is, in the face of death and suffering, still be able to say, God is love. This is the good news. This is what the gospel is all about. That God is love. I will tell you that to be true from my own experience, which is not an experience that says God is love, which means you don't suffer. I will tell you that is true with a certainty from my own experience. The message of peace that Christ brought through his life, brought through his suffering, his cross, brought through his death and resurrection, the message of peace that Christ brought is God is love. If that is not so, there cannot be an ounce of peace in the human situation. We are living in a nightmare. The message of peace that I bring to you in my little way, not from logic, but from an experience of 23 years, which I tell you is true, is the same message of peace. God is love. The gospel story is a God story, and it's a love story. My story that I just communicated to you is a God story and a love story. And my experience is that your story is a God story and a love story. Before you were and I was, during our life and our suffering, and after our cross, there is a benign presence, caring for each, now and always and forever and ever.